Okay, so it's time. It's that time of the week where we are
It
going
is.
to be having our presentation, Future-Proofing Your Business with a Risk Management Plan. Lou,
Well,
can you...
today's speaker has had a long and successful career with nearly 40 years working as a business teacher. He's a writer, a mentor, a leadership coach, and he's certainly faced his fair share of difficulties. He's worked with a wide range of businesses, from large Fortune 500 corporations to small businesses across the globe, as well as facing the ultimate challenge that we can all relate to, starting several businesses of his own. And he's now taking all that knowledge and experience and sharing it with small businesses to help them discover more and learn and improve themselves and grow their business. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today, Peter Messervy.
Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. Good morning. It's nice to be here, sitting in my isolation and meeting all a nice bunch of people.
Well, it's lovely to have you here. So we're going to hand over the session to you now. We will turn off our video and our mics, but we're here watching and learning along with our members. If there are any problems, we will step in. But over to you, Peter.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I've got to share my screen and go into the presentation. So the session today is future-proofing your business. What I mean by future-proofing is anticipating the future and being ready for what it may have to offer. Being ready is, of course, having a plan of action and having resources set aside so that it doesn't crash your business when it occurs. This process is known in business circles as risk management. So my intention is to share with you a simple but very effective risk management process that will help you plan and understand how more effectively to deal with future disruptions. So my goals here help you understand the risk management process. You can see the list of goals. I've got practice using techniques with a case study. That, of course, won't be done in the presentation here, but we may get a chance to look at some of that in the following workshop for those who are interested in doing it. And the agenda has 5 sections, and we'll come back to this list each time we switch the groups to keep so that you keep track of it. And a couple of hints here. I go through this fairly quickly. There's a fair amount of detail. So ideally, pay attention, try not to get sidetracked. And there's a couple of hints and tips on how to do that, avoiding interruptions. Notice the bottom comment. What you get from the workshop is proportional to what you can put into it in terms of attention and time. And one key thing, one of my Opus Magnum training mantras, nobody knows everything, so and everybody knows something useful. So never be embarrassed by the things you don't yet know. And back to my agenda list, this is what we're going to go through, and I'm going to start with the risk management concepts. Now, business risk is any adverse event which will affect your business. It can affect your profitability. It can affect your continuity of business, and so on. And it can be internal or external to the business. It can affect business goals as well. So that's what we're going to work with. I use 3 different types of risk specified. There's natural risk, are the things that are outside your control, acts of God, weather, those sorts of things, and of course those silly things like pandemics that keep hitting us. Those are the things that we really can't do anything about, but we can think about that they might happen in our area. We're not in an earthquake zone, but some people are. Then the assumed risk is where you have deliberately chosen to take a risk. When you started a business, you basically did that. You decided that you're going to take the risk of being profitable and making it work because the rewards are worth it. So assumed risk is something you choose to take on. And the third one, activity risk, are the things that you don't necessarily choose to take on, but they are part of the activities you do. If you hire people, they might get sick, they might not be as trustworthy as you hoped, and that sort of thing. So those are the risks that you mostly deal with. Now, the concept of risk always applies where there is uncertainty. On the far left of this chart, you have no information, and basically that means you don't know what you don't know. But in that situation, there's no way to measure any kind of risk. You just have no clue what can happen. On the far right is total information, and that's when you have the least amount of risk. Nobody has, of course, complete control over the future, so there's always some degree of risk, however much information that you have. And the degree of risk is dependent upon the degree of certainty and uncertainty in the information you have. And of course, as I said, mentioned, it is all about opportunity. When you take an opportunity, it's accompanied with risk. I don't know how many of you are gamblers. I'm not going to ask you to own up to that. But if you ever bought a lottery ticket, then you're a gambler. And it might be a fact that you paid £1 or £2 for a lottery ticket, and the rewards were something in the region of multi-million. So you're willing to take that risk of losing the £1 or £2 for the really rare 1 in 40 million opportunity of making a win. Now, if the lottery ticket cost £100 or £1,000, also the outcome is still 40 million, would you still do it? So the concept of risk tolerance is how much are you prepared to stick your neck out with the hope of getting the planned opportunity. And the more you know about the circumstances in which you're operating, the greater your ability to manage risk tolerance. I talked about assumed risk. Typically, when you acquire, start, or restart a business, you're looking at the cost of the business, you're looking at the benefits you expect, and ideally, you're also looking at the risk. You're measuring the risk. So your cost-benefit analysis is technically the 3 parts. The cost-benefit-risk analysis is what you should be doing. This is the part that we're going to work through today. So the concepts of risk management now have 4 basic parts to it. You can see them here: identifying the risk, recognizing what it is that can come up, and the assessment. We need some method of quantifying the risks so we can put them in some kind of order and understand which ones to deal with. And the response planning, of course, is the heart of the activity. What can we do? Prepare. How can we prepare? What kind of planning can we do to avoid being impacted by the risk? And then the final part is just monitoring the risks, keeping track of what changes, keeping the risk plan updated. And we're going to look at each one of these now in separate parts. Just a question of why we do this. Early identification of difficult projects is a comment here. If you've got something coming up in your business and you're not sure what about its outcome, then a risk management exercise will help you understand the possibilities of the opportunities and the risks or difficulties you may come across. And at that point, it increases your ability to make good decisions. You might choose to not do the project. You might choose to go ahead, and you might choose to go ahead with a degree of preparation or cost involved in avoiding risk. So early risk recognition of issues and problems is the key to it. And the reason for having a method is because you can't possibly deal with every risk that comes your way. You've got to look at what you think are the greatest risks to your specific business and then be able to focus on those. We need a method to be able to single those out. And that's what we're going to look at now. Also, risk management is a coping mechanism. When we engage in a risk, or when a risk or an event occurs, we tend to be under stress, or we might even have fear involved. And as soon as we have stress or fear, then the brain acts differently. We lose the blood, if you like, to our thinking brain, and therefore our decision-making and planning mechanism is not working properly. We're in our fight or flight method. And as such, we don't make good decisions. The idea of having a plan is that when you've got a problem come up, you don't have to make any decisions. You simply go to the plan and execute what you've prepared for, what you know. You just follow the instructions that you have given yourself in a more organized moment. The military does this all the time, of course. This is how they operate in total. Risk commenced really back in the 1600s. When Edward Lloyd had a coffee shop and used to entertain a lot of bankers and investors. And bankers and investors in those days made their wealth usually by overseas trade, by sailing ships, traveling the world and bringing goods. And there were high losses. There was a war, there were pirates, there was weather, all kinds of reasons why a ship didn't come home with your profits. And what Edward Lloyd and his group did was they decided they would share the risk. Everybody would invest into a pot of money, and they would each share in each other's ventures. So if anyone lost, then it had minimal impact. This was really the first approach to tackling or handling risk. And it's managed here by the concept, came out in the Wall Street Economist a while ago. The notion of bringing risk under control is one of the central ideas that distinguishes our modern times from the more distant past. And for that purpose, we're going to move from the mythology, the distant past, the dragons of risk, into the modern age and look at a practical risk management method. So the first part of that process is the risk identification. And this involves, as we see, finding the sources of risk. Now, the reason it's difficult, of course, is because we're not very good at predicting the future. As most meteorologists and market traders will know, we can't do it perfectly. So we need some kind of method for it. Now, mathematics helps, templates help, but they don't substitute for intuition and experience. So typically, good risk identification is done by sharing, involving with other people, sharing viewpoints and experiences. So I come up with some ways to look for risks, and this will help you finding your basic risk management process. So the things to consider are listed here. I'm just going to take a quick look at each one of these, but I'm only going to focus on one for our session today. So business success criteria. Look at your own business and decide what are the key factors that govern your success. Is it doing things on time? Is it scheduling? Is it managing costs, being able to profit with a narrow margin? Is it having the highest quality to retain your customers? Is it hitting a particular value point in the market? So looking at which are your success criteria, then you examine what are the things in that particular aspect that could go wrong. So that's one type of list that you can create. Second one is risk influencing factors. This is just an alternate list. If you look at the list here, you can see these are the different criteria that you might think about. And the way to do this really is to set your list up as a heading and then list underneath it the things you can think of that would cause a problem to occur, or the things that might happen within that area. You all have a business plan, of course, carefully written out, and that you look at it every month. And these are the kinds of things where you've often put in assumptions or hopes of the future. And you look at those and you identify the things which in your plan have a risk or an unknown. So that's another way to find particular risks related to your business. Management and process risks, another list, nothing always self-explanatory here. And then the one I really want to deal with today is risk categories. Based on any or all of the previous ones, or starting from scratch, you can build a list of risk categories as they're related to your business. You can see the list I've started here. Things like business personnel. What can go wrong? Well, we can have HR problems, we can have sickness, we can have absence, we can have lack of productivity. So think about those, think about the impact. Any one of these you examine for detail. Now, to get that, I've created a list, but every business would be unique. So your first task when you take on risk management would be to sit down and create your own list. Look at the techniques I've offered here, look at or think about your own, and come up with a draft list of categories, headings that you think are important to your business or the way you operate your business. And that's the first step. Just start with that list. There are, starting the list is one. Risk analysis techniques are listed here. Brainstorming. What I'm pointing out is there are a number of methods of doing risk analysis. Some of them are extremely mathematically oriented. And we're not going to tackle any of these today. I just want you to recognize that there are some very scientific, or at least theoretically scientific processes. Many years ago, I worked on a major oil and gas project, and this was a cross-Canada pipeline. And the risk analysis was handled by 5 mathematicians at Stanford University. And if you printed it out, it would take several volumes on a shelf, and it studied all kinds of activities and things that would be affecting a major multinational cross-company pipe project. So that's the extreme. In our world, we're just looking at small business, which just needs to deal with something that they can do simply and effectively without too much mathematicians attached to it. So the next step you will take when you've got your list is to define each of the risks. You'll create a brief statement that describes the condition, and the condition being what are the circumstances when the risk occurs, what does it look like, and then the consequences, how does that affect your business, what is the negative impact that you will have to face. Spending a little time working on the definition is a good way to understand it more clearly. And of course, it initiates the creative thinking in you. So it allows you to start working towards a solution process. And this, again, is a main key to what we're about. We want to be able to think about the risks. We want to be able to exercise our creative process in coming up with possible solutions. And if we can do that with more than just ourselves, that's even more effective. Now, you have in your pack a risk assessment worksheet. This is what it looks like. And what I've done here is lay out my risks, just a suggestion here. So this is the sheet you would use. And the first step is to take a separate sheet for each of the categories that you've identified. So I've selected my first category here, which is, I've decided is my brand and reputation. That can be at risk. And then I look at what kind of risks would that entail? Well, here's one. Customer writes a bad review online. So don't like that. What are the consequences to my business? And I'll write that down. Well, I could lose market share. My customers might not pay attention to me or might go elsewhere. And so I would go through my particular risks on that category and list them all here, list the consequences. That's all I do at the moment. I don't have to look at the other columns for this stage. So that would be your second step in the process. List your risks and answer the consequences based on each category. So that's the identification process. By the way, if you have questions, please write them down. I'll give you some time to, at the end of this, to come up with the Q&A session, and you'll have times in the following workshop as well, of course. So having got the identification, having created the list, we now need to talk about some kind of assessment. And that means to understand the effects. And I want some quantification because we need to prioritize. Prioritizing is important, as I said before, because we can't deal with them all. We need to know which are the most important ones. And as I said, it's a lot of intangible factors here, but having the list, having a method, helps you think more structurally through the process. Now, there are three major elements to risk assessment, these subcategories, if you like. The probability, meaning what are the chances of it happening? Is it highly likely? Is it very remote opportunity? I need to recognize that. How often are we exposed to the risk? Do I need to keep it in my plan constantly, or is it some short-term activity? And then if it happens, how bad is the effect on my business? And we need some kind of quantification method to deal with those. We'll deal them one step at a time. So probability, how likely is the risk to occur? And I use a 1 to 10 scale because that gives me a convenient separation. Some people like just a 3-part scale here. If you're just a small business with a few risks, that might be sufficient. A lot of the businesses I deal with have quite considerable risk planning. So 1 to 10 is more significant. I use the 1 to 10 here today just to illustrate, but whether you use 1 to 5, 1 to 3, 1 to 10, doesn't matter. That's up to you. So here in my example, I've come up with the probability. How likely do I think it is that a customer writes a bad review online? I've given it 5 out of 10. Because the online world today is unpredictable and you're always upsetting somebody, I consider it's a 50-50 chance that somebody will eventually give me a bad review. What happens? Would customers get confused over my products? Well, some of my products can be fairly complex. So yes, I would say from my experience in having conversations that I haven't streamlined my offerings clearly enough to give me a perfect score on that. So I'm saying 7 out of 10. People are going to misunderstand what I hope to communicate to them. And what if one of my products develops a flaw? Fairly low, got a lot of experience, a lot of practice, so it's much less likely that I'll have a problem with that. So that's how I deal with my probability of occurrence. This is your next step in the process. You take your list and you go through the conditions you've listed and you identify your probability score. 1 for low, 10 for high probability. The second one is the risk impact. Exactly the same technique, but this is about how bad is it if it happens to my business. 1 being, well, not very bad, I can deal with it, I'll probably get over it fairly quickly, minor cost, minor mishap. Up to 10, which is very serious, could be a showstopper. So those are the things I want to be concerned with. Again, you can use the 1 to 10, or you can use any lesser sequence of numbers. So here I've done the same thing. I've taken a look at what does loss of market share mean to me? Well, I think that's pretty significant. So I've given that an 8 out of 10. I don't want my customers going elsewhere. I don't want to be losing customers. It's hard enough these days to generate market share. So on the confusion arising, I've given that a 4 because I can usually intervene and deal with that fairly effectively and fairly quickly. Product gets a bad review, however, is really bad. So that can be a showstopper. That could destroy my credibility in the marketplace. So I definitely don't want that to happen. So that's how I would deal with that score. And that would be your next step, which is to look at your impact column and following the same procedure, go through your list and score your impacts, 1 for low, 10 for high. Then the severity. Quite simple. You take the probability score, multiply it by the impact score, and that's your severity. And the purpose of that is it gives you your separation to identify which are the most significant in your thinking and which are the least. And you can do that by that multiplication process, a fairly quick activity to go through, and you calculate the severity, put the results in that column. When you've done that, you've got a method of prioritizing. Now, if you're online, if you've got an electronic worksheet, then of course you can reorder the worksheet by sorting it into descending order of severity, and you can choose a cutoff point. You may decide to deal with the top 10 or the top 5 or the top 50 or 50%. Again, this is up to you. This depends on the sensitivity of your business to any of these events and which ones are the most serious. So you look at the ones that you're going to deal with. And of course, you disregard those below your cutoff simply because you can't deal with everything. There just isn't the time or the resources to handle all of the risks you can think of. Now, in our case, I've just said all of that. It would be impractical to try to manage them all, and the quantification helps us think through and manage the selection. It's easier than just looking at a list and trying to prioritize it in your head. So there's my prioritization. In this case, I didn't have to sort the numbers because they turned out to be a 1, 2, 3, but it could be in any order. If you've got the list on paper, then you just number them according to the highest and lowest scores. And that gives you the cutoff point you want and puts the most important ones at the top of your list. So that's your final step using the risk assessment worksheet. This now gives you a risk list, gives you the seriousness of that risk through the severity calculation, and gives you the priorities in the order in which you need to be prepared for them or be ready to deal with them. And now we come to the heart of the matter, which is really planning for the response. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a risk, I want to create an environment that allows me to recover. So it might be something I can do. It might be something that I prepare for and have in advance. It's proactive, meaning that I think about it in advance, I plan for it in advance, and hopefully I have resources set aside. And just interestingly enough, it was possible to identify the fact of a pandemic. We've had 5 pandemics in the last 140 years. The Spanish flu in 1919 was one of our biggest, and that took a lot more lives than we're losing today. It was much bigger than today. Interestingly enough, the expert who suggested that we have isolation and shutdown was fired for being overdramatic. And of course, the processes were pretty random at the time. We've had enough pandemics for each country to be able to recognize that it can happen again and be prepared for it. The only 2 countries in the world who recognized that were South Korea and Taiwan. And they had the plan, they had the budget set aside, they had the tools and equipment, the suits, the masks, and everything they needed. And as soon as the pandemic hit, they were able to react immediately, close their borders, and they had the least amount of trouble from the process, at least so far. So there was no excuse for not being ready for what we've got today. So the planning process, this is what we go through. We've done with the prioritized list. That's the first thing you created. We've decided which ones we'll manage by the prioritization. And then we look at each risk individually and we decide, is it controllable in some way or not? Can I do anything about it, or do I just have to wait and see if it happens? If it is controllable, then I might look at what causes it and can I mitigate the causes? Or if it's uncontrollable, then can I look at the effects of that and have something ready to deal with the effects? The risk response plans, the proactive part is is there a way I can avoid incurring the risk? I might choose not to take it, but I'll look at some methods of dealing with that in a moment. Can I reduce the probability, that is, the likelihood that it will happen by doing something, a different strategy, or taking an easier path? Can I minimize the impact in some way? In other words, what can I have in place, or what can I have ready that means that if it happens, it won't be as bad as it could be? And then the second part here is the contingency plan. I should, in any event, have a contingency plan. What if, in spite of my preparation, it happens and it's hurtful? Then what would I do about it? What is my path of response? So this is where I talked about the excuse me, where I talked about the being prepared as being a ability to think clearly. So your strategies are as follows. You can live with it. You can choose acceptance. That is, I can see the risk. I'm aware of it. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'll just keep it in mind and react if it happens. It's kind of like buying insurance, really. Do I pay for insurance in the chance that something will go wrong, or do I just self-insure and I'll pay for it when it occurs? This is your choice. So you look at which risks are you willing to accept. Now, avoidance is that you've decided that it is way too serious to deal with. I want to eliminate the cause. Let's say if I were visiting the Pacific Northwest, for example, and I decided that I would like to go hiking in the Rockies, I could put my backpack together and pack my lunch and take a compass and a phone, and off I head into the wilderness. Now, of course, I may not be aware that I could meet bears and even a cougar. I may not realize that the magnetic fields in the Rockies can ruin my compass direction, and that I don't have any coverage for my mobile phone. And also the weather can drop from +20 to -10 in about 10 minutes, and I could freeze to death. Now, if I studied the plan and I looked at all of those things, I might decide that, hey, you know what? I'm just not ready for that. So I might choose a lesser risky hike instead of the Rockies. So I've eliminated the cause in that case. Transfer to another party is where obviously I give the responsibility to somewhere else. Supposing I were taking my minibus and I had invited a bunch of local kids to take a drive to visit Disneyland. I might start worrying about whether the bus would make it, whether there were any mechanical problems. What would I do if I got a flat tire? Could I handle it? So instead of taking my own vehicle, maybe I would rent one, and that would be transferring the responsibility of looking after it and replacing it to another party, which means their experience in handling that, it would happen quickly with the minimum impact to my own group. And then mitigation is simply taking a look at what caused the problem in the first place. What was the severity? Are there things I can do to reduce the likelihood of those happening, to reduce the severity? Those are the strategies that you can employ when you're dealing with the planning process. So there we go. The risk acceptance. It is likely if the risk is totally understood and the probability and consequence have been analyzed. And the other factor is sometimes the cost of mitigation outweighs the severity. If I still wanted to do my hiking trip, then I might want to have to invest in a lot of equipment and some clothing and safety gear, so that the cost of that might not justify the trip I want to take. And I'll make that decision. And then the conscious choice then is definitely that I only deal with it if it happens. But I still should have a contingency plan that says, how will I deal with it if it happens? Because that would avoid me making my stress decisions. Risk avoidance, as we said, not doing it, creating a condition that will not encounter it, and or will recover immediately. So that's taking the appropriate action to minimize it. And then the transfer we mentioned, I talked about that. Somebody else will provide it. And the mitigation, reducing one of the two descriptive categories in your risk, the probability or the impact. The contingency planning should always be done. Identifies the actions you will take and the resources you need in the event of the risk occurring. Just think what would happen if on the 1st of February, Boris had stepped up to the microphone and said, okay, folks, we've got a pandemic. We're going to open up our warehouses and send out all our masks and equipment to the healthcare people. We're going to ask you all to self-isolate. We're going to ask the businesses to close down except the essential ones. We're ready for this. We've got a budget to pay for all your wages while we wait, and we'll take care of this. It'll be resolved in about 2 months. Boy, would that get him some votes, I think. But I guess he didn't do that. So I think maybe he didn't have a contingency plan. Anyway, you should in your business, your livelihood may depend on it. So contingency planning should be for all the risks that you can think of. Contingencies, of course, can be resources you might be able to set aside. I know a lot of business owners who say they have a 3-month budget, which allows them to continue if they lost all of their customers and were forced to shut down. There are other kinds of contingency plans and budgets that you can set aside. Large corporations, of course, that face the threat of being sued have huge funds set aside for recovery or for paying off lawsuits and so on. It depends on the size and exposure of your business. But there should always be something for the unidentified risks. The fact that we have a risk plan doesn't guarantee that we've thought of everything that could go wrong. So we should still prepare for the possibility that something might happen that we didn't think of. And the contingencies is your being self-insured purpose. Now, here's the planning worksheet. This is the one you've also been sent this in your package. And what we look at is that you look at the top half of this, and your risk condition is, you would simply pull that out from your risk assessment sheet, and you would expand on the definition a little. A clarity of definition is important. You may be looking at this months down the road. You may be sharing it with other people who need to understand exactly what you meant. So spending a little time making sure the definition is clear is important. Same thing with the consequence. You transfer that from your assessment worksheet and you copy over the numbers. This gives you a separate worksheet for every risk that you're going to deal with. Of course, you only do this for the ones that you've identified that are in your planning detail. Once you've done that, then you go to this bottom half and you've got 3 boxes on the left, which are what are the kinds of things I can think of that would avoid incurring the risk? What can I do? As everything from not doing it to taking a different strategy. And what are the ones I could think of? And on the box to the right of that, what would be the impact on my business of me taking those actions? Not the impact of the risk, but the impact of me taking the avoiding action. And so how different would my business look if I did that? And then the mitigation one is if I can't do the elimination or if that doesn't work, what are the mitigating strategies? Sometimes I have both of those boxes. Sometimes it's only one or the other. And then the third one is where do I put my contingency plan? What do I do if it happens to me anyway? That's your next step, or the penultimate steps in your risk planning process. So that's really the main structure. We're going to do a couple of final thoughts here. You should have a risk plan. It should be well documented. But just like your business plan, it should be reviewed periodically. If you're a small business, at least once a quarter, ideally once a month, brief review. And of course, if you have any major changes to your business, a new product, change in direction, or if there is a major disruption and you want to rethink under the conditions we have today, this is probably a really good place to start your new risk management plan or your first one if you haven't had one before. And identify the things that could happen or continue to go wrong with what's going on today. You should also try and keep a risk log. That is, what are the things that happened that you didn't think of? This gives you obviously future planning ideas. And then if something does happen, the effectiveness of how you dealt with it, what are good response strategies. This can be a very powerful document. If you happen to be an entrepreneur and work in several businesses, it can obviously share between one and the other. If you're in groups like our alpha group meeting, like your masterminds, it's a great opportunity to share benefits and ideas with each other of how these things have been dealt with. So the value of risk management is very significant. It obviously helps you survive a disruptive event. Most important, it gets you up and running soon after a disruption. One of the key things, of course, is however bad it gets, you've somehow got to keep going and put things back together. So your risk management is your preparation for that. You're pre-thinking on how would I deal with that? How would I make that happen? It's a recognition that insurance never covers everything, and sometimes it's very hard to deal with insurance companies. They like to find ways to get out of things. Their risk management plan involves trying to get you not to claim. And by the way, the government doesn't cover everything either, so don't count on them. It also gives you credibility with your lenders and investors if you have them, with your insurance company. By the way, they will give you better rates if they know you have risk planning. And also your customers. It tells them that you're able to survive serious events. As I mentioned at the beginning, it is also a very effective coping mechanism. We need to be able to cope with the stress when the crisis occurs, and we can do that comfortably if we have some way, if we know we've got a plan to react. So next steps, just a quick pointing out here, this is my commercial, if you like. I run an Essential Skills Workshop Club, which is a monthly club. You get a full workshop every month. We get, there are also overview webinars, which are absolutely free and published, offered every month. And this is one this is what you're getting here today. Then we have a Getting Started workshop, which is the same material that you looked at, but it's a hands-on practical where you actually get to fill out and share the components of the exercise parts that we've done. As a small group, we work together on dealing with that. The in-depth workshop is a full day where you get to develop your full risk plan. And then the final stage is a one-to-one expert coaching and mentoring where it takes you through the solution. Usually that's for my larger clients. And by the way, the hub offer is that during 2020, due to our current crisis, and we don't know when it will expire, I'm offering a 50% discount for the remainder of this year if anybody wants to take on any of these opportunities. And then just a final few, these are the things that I run as Opus Magnum: the Workshop Club, the Planning Club, which is a monthly and quarterly planning, the Alpha Group, which I would not offer to you because you have your own mastermind sessions that deal with that. And you probably have all your own local coaches, so that would not apply to you as well. But those are the areas that I work in. And that is by the completion of my process. So thank you very much for paying your attention and for not getting distracted. And I hope you got something valuable out of it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. That was so interesting. Always a useful skill to have that strategic overview of the risk and where your business is positioned to some degree. So thank you very much for that. Have anybody got any questions before we take a quick break and come back for the workbook session? Any questions that you would like to ask? Pop them in the Q&A section and we will do our very best to get to them. I've got one question, Peter. Just it's a broad it's a broad question, but is there a difference between the strategies that you implement as a startup and a one-man band perhaps than a large business? I understand there's possibly different risk, but is it the same approach for different size businesses?
The approach is identical. I mean, the concept of risk management is exactly the same. However complex the mathematical process goes, they're still doing exactly the same things. There are mathematical models, there are techniques for creating a risk list. There are strategies that a company involves by having meetings with key people who understand some of the risks, the technical risks, and so on. So an IT company with a big IT group would have meetings with their IT departments to come up with their own risk management, and they would compile them. So yes, but the steps are identical. They're just simply more complex the bigger you get.
Yes, yeah, I appreciate that there would be perhaps more people involved and more things to think about, but it's encouraging to know that it's the same for large businesses as well as small businesses. Okay, we're going to have our break right now.
Sorry, Stu, sorry, before we go,
yeah.
Peter, I just wanted to find out, can we talk specifically in the second half, can we cover a little bit about returning to work risk assessments specifically in relation to COVID-19? Because I know with the tenants that we've got in the buildings, etc., it'd be nice to just sort of cover that to see what we have to actually specifically need to do with regard to COVID-19. Is there any input that we can do that in the second half, just briefly?
Yes, absolutely. And I
Brilliant.
can certainly have some concepts I can share with you on that.
That'd be great, because a lot of people in our community are at that point now that, you know, with the messages coming out from government, etc., looking at to return to work. So we just need to kind of maybe cover about that specifically, the risk assessment. So that would be great. So if we could maybe have a chat about that at the beginning of the second half.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Peter.
As always, afterwards, the resources will be in the members area of the website, including a rerun of Peter's talk, but the workbook as well. So if you don't have your workbook, raise your hand now or look in your inbox, because that's where it's going to be. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back at 10:44 exactly. So we'll see you then, and we will be back with the second half of the session. See you soon. Goodbye.
Great. See you soon.